Hello everyone, welcome to Chapter 6, Validity. So, in everyday language, we say that something is valid if it is sound, meaningful, or well-grounded in principles or evidence. For example, we speak of a valid theory, a valid argument, or a valid reason. In the language of psychological assessment, validity is a term used in conjunction with the meaningfulness of a test score, what the test score truly means. These are the topics that we are going to discuss for this chapter. First, the concept of validity. In psychology, there are many ways to measure psychological trait, such as survey, observation, interview, questionnaires, brain scans, and other samples. These are few of the many tools used in psychological measurement. But what happens when a tool doesn't measure what it's supposed to measure? Example: imagine that we wanted to measure the level of extroversion of a person. We'll write a survey with regards to extroversion. If our survey has high validity, it has a good job in measuring the extroversion of people. If it has a medium level of validity, it might be measuring something else, not solely or mainly on extroversion itself. If it has low validity, it might be measuring something else entirely, like intelligence. Then, why is still validity important? Because this will enable us to know that a test really measures what it purports to measure. Validity is, as applied to a test, is a judgment or estimate of how well a test measures what it purports to measure in a particular context. Now, why is the phrase valid test sometimes misleading? Because no test or measurement technique is universally valid for all time, for all uses, with all types of test taker populations. Rather, there may be shown to be valid within what we called a reasonable boundaries. So, if that reasonable boundaries exceeded, then the validity of the test may be called into question. Now, in order to know that a certain test is really valid, then it must undergo validation. So, validation is the process of gathering and evaluating evidence about validity, wherein both the test developer and the test user may play a role in the validation of a test for a specific purpose. It is the developer's responsibility to supply validity evidence in the test manual. It may sometimes be appropriate for test users to conduct their own validation studies with their own group of test takers. We also have what we call local validation. These studies are absolutely necessary when a test user plans to alter in some way the format, instructions, language, or content of the test. Local studies would be necessary if a test user sought to use a test with a population of test takers that differed in some significant way from the population on which the test was standardized. For example, a test user sought to transform a nationally standardized test into Braille because he or she wanted to administer this test to blind or visually impaired test takers. Now, one way measurement specialists have traditionally conceptualized validity is according to three categories: criterion, related validity, content validity, and construct validity. Now, content validity, measure of validity based on evaluation of the subject's topics, or content covered by the items in the test. This shows evidence that test items adequately reflects the test domain. This also usually results in high face validity. Its goal is to really ensure that you comprehensively capture or cover the test domain of interest. Next, we have criterion-related validity. This is a measure of validity obtained by evaluating the relationship of scores obtained on the test scores on the other test. This shows that the test is able to predict the behavior that it is designed to predict. This can be via concurrent and predictive validation techniques. This will answer the question, do the results correspond to a different test of the same thing? Next is the construct validity. This is a measure of validity that is arrived at by executing a comprehensive analysis of how scores on the test relate to other test scores and measures, and how scores on the test can be understood with some theoretical framework for understanding the construct that the test was designed to measure. So, this shows evidence that a test adequately captures the concept or the design that it really wanted to capture. This will somehow answer the question, did the test really capture the psychological concept that it wants to capture? Next, we also have this, what we call the Trinitian view, wherein construct validity is visualized as the umbrella validity because every other variety of validity falls under it. Next is the strategies. These strategies are ways of approaching the process of test validations, or this can be a different plans of attack. We speak, for example, of content validation strategies, criterion-related validation strategies, and construct validation strategies. Now, we also have what we called ecological validity. This refers to a judgment regarding how well a test measures what it purports to measure at the time and place that the variable being measured is actually emitted. Now, there's this one example that I've watched in YouTube, wherein suppose that you are interested in studying how people respond to life-threatening situations. So, you create a virtual simulation of a plane crash. You take 10 participants and record their behaviors, pulse, and adrenaline levels they go through the virtual simulation. After that, you found out that heart rate and adrenaline increases during the stimulation, and you've also noticed that majority of the participants were able to follow the safety instructions that were given in the first place. Now, if the test results to high ecological validity, you can generalize that the findings to real-life settings. Next, let's go with face validity. When you say face validity, this is the relevance of the test items. It is a subjective assessment whether or not your study or test measures what it is supposed to measure. A judgment concerning how relevant the test items appear to be, is what I've said. Example, if the measure of depression includes items like I feel sad, or I feel down, or I cry a lot, then it would have evidence for being face valid. This is Mr. Rodney Dangerfield. He was famous for complaining, I don't get no respect. Somewhat analogously, The concept of phase validity has been described as the Rodney-Dangerfield of psychometric variables because it has received little attention and even less respect from researchers examining the construct validity of psychological tests and measures. As what I've mentioned earlier, that content validity usually results in high phase validity. Next is Mr. Adam Showmaker. He is a PhD and a human resource consultant for talent acquisition of Tampa, Florida. He emphasized that a test's lack of phase validity could contribute to a lack of confidence in the perceived effectiveness of the test, with a consequential decrease in the test taker's cooperation or motivation to do his or her best during the test. So, he emphasized that in a corporate environment, lack of phase validity may lead to unwillingness of administrators or managers to buy in to use a particular test. He says that the moral of this story is that as scientists, we have to remember that reliability and validity are super important in the development and implementation of a test. But as human beings, we have to remember that the test we end up using must also be easy to use and appear phase valid for both the candidate and the administrator. For more explanation about phase validity, you can also refer to this link. This was attached in the PPT. Next is the content validity. This describes a judgment of how adequately a test samples behavior representative of the universe of behavior that a test was designed to sample. This is how well a test measures the behavior for which it is intended to measure. Suppose a teacher is going to test the mathematical ability of her student. So, the domains of the test items must include statistics, algebra, algorithm, geometry, and other branches of mathematics. Now, with respect to educational achievement tests, it is customary to consider a test content valid measure when the proportion of material covered by the test approximates the proportion of material covered in the course. Another example for content validity is that depression is defined by a mood and by cognitive and physiological symptoms. If the new measure of depression was content valid, then it would include items from each of these domains, items from cognitive, mood, and physiological symptoms. Next, we have this what we call text blueprint. This is somewhat familiar to architecture and engineering, wherein the test blueprint contains the format, the plans of a certain project of a certain building. Now, in psychology, test blueprint is a structure of the evaluation, a plan regarding the types of information to be covered by the test items, the number of items topping each area of coverage, and the organization of the items in the test, and so forth. Behavioral observation is one technique frequently used in blueprinting the content areas to be covered in certain types of employment tests. The test developer will observe successful veterans on the job, note the behaviors necessary for success on the job, and design the test to include a representative sample of those behaviors. Now, let's bump into culture and the relativity of content validity. Tests are often thought of as either valid or not valid. Culture and the relativity of content validity. Tests are often thought of as either valid or not valid. A history test, for example, either does or does not accurately measure one's knowledge of historical fact. However, it is also true that what constitutes historical fact depends to some extent on who is writing the history. Consider a test containing the true-false item. Colonel Claus von Stauffenberg is a hero. Such an item is useful in illustrating the cultural relativity affecting item scoring. In 1944, von Stauffenberg, a German officer, was an active participant in a bomb plot to assassinate Germany's leader, Adolf Hitler. When the plot failed, von Stauffenberg was executed and promptly vilified in Germany as a despicable traitor. Today, the light of history shines favorably on von Stauffenberg, and he is perceived as a hero in Germany. A German postage stamp with his face on it was issued to honor von Stauffenberg's 100th birthday. Now, in their culture, they consider von Stauffenberg as a hero for attempting to assassinate the Germany's leader Adolf Hitler. But on the other culture, they can possibly consider also von Stauffenberg as not a hero. Next, on this picture, Austro-Hungarian Archduke Franz Ferdinand and his wife Sophia are pictured as they left Sarajevo's City Hall on June 28, 1914. Moments later, Ferdinand would be assassinated by Gavrilo Princip, shown in custody at right. The killing served as a catalyst for World War I and is discussed and analyzed in history textbooks in every language around the world. Now, say for example, this is a test. A momentous event in the history of the world, one that served as a catalyst for World War I, Archduke Franz Ferdinand was assassinated on June 28, 1914 by a Serb named Gavrilo Princip. Now, think about how you would answer the following multiple item on a history test. Gavrilo Princip was A. a poet, B. a hero, C. a terrorist, D. a nationalist, or E. all of the above. For various textbooks in the Bosnian region of the world, choice E, all of the above, is the correct answer. Hedges 1997 observed that textbooks in area of Bosnia and Herzegovina that were controlled by different ethnic groups imported widely varying characterizations of the assassin. In the Serb-controlled region of the country, historical books, and presumably the test constructed to measure students' learning, regarded Princip as a hero and a poet. By contrast, Croatian students might read that Princip was an assassin trained to commit a terrorist act. Muslims in the region were taught that Princip was a nationalist whose deeds sparked in anti-Serbian rioting. So, culture really varies. The answers of the people really depends on the culture that they know or that they are in. For more definition or explanation about content validity, you may also refer this on this link. Now, let's proceed to criterion validity. Criterion validity is a judgment of how adequately a test score can be used to infer an individual's most probable standing on some measure of interest, the measure of interest being the criterion. The two types of criterion-related validity are concurrent and predictive validity. Now let's define first what is a criterion. When you say criterion, it is the standard against which a test or a test score is evaluated, meaning it has its own boundaries or limitations. For example, if a test purports to measure the trait of athleticism, we might expect to employ membership in a health club or any generally accepted measure of physical fitness as a criterion in evaluating whether the athleticism test truly measures athleticism. Now, a criterion has three characteristics. First, an adequate criterion is relevant. Second, an adequate criterion measures must also be valid for the purpose for which it is being used. And third, ideally, a criterion is also uncontaminated. An adequate criterion is relevant. By this, we mean that it is pertinent or applicable to the matter at hand. Example, a test purporting to advise test takers whether they share the same interests of successful actors to have been validated using the interests of successful actors as a criterion. Next, an adequate criterion measure must also be valid for the purpose for which it is being used. If one test, X, is being used as a criterion to validate second test, which is a Y, then evidence should exist the test X is valid. Example, a test purporting to measure depression is said to have been validated using a criterion, the diagnosis made by a blue ribbon panel of psychodiagnosticians. If a test user might wish to probe further regarding variables such as credentials of the blue ribbon panel and the actual procedures used to validate a diagnosis of depression, answers to such question would help address the issue of whether the criterion was indeed valid. Next, ideally, a criterion is also uncontaminated. Is a term applied to a criterion measures that has been based, at least in part, on predictor measures. Example, consider a hypothetical inmate violence potential test designed to test a prisoner's potential for violence in the cell block. In this part, this evaluation entails ratings from fellow inmates, guards, and other staff in order to come up with a number that represents each inmate's violence potential. After all the inmates in the study have been given scores on this test, the study authors then attempt to validate the test by asking guards to rate each inmate in their own violence potential. Because the guards' opinions were used to formulate the inmates' test scores in the first place, the guards' opinions cannot be used as a criterion against which to judge the soundness of the test. If the guards' opinions were used both as a predictor and a criterion, then we would say that criterion contamination had occurred. You may also visit the links below to learn more about criterion-related. Now, under criterion-related validity is concurrent validity. This means that if the test scores are obtained at about the same time as the criterion measures are obtained, measures of the relationship between the test scores and the criterion provide evidence of concurrent validity. From the word itself, current, same time. Example, if two groups of participants were given the measures and they differed in predictable ways, if those in therapy for depression scored higher than those in therapy for an anxiety disorder, then this would be evidence for concurrent validity. Here is a real-life example of a concurrent validity study in which a group of researchers explored whether tests validated for use with adults could be used with adolescents. This is the Beck depression inventory and its revision. The Beck Depression Inventory tool are self-report measures used to identify symptoms of depression and quantify their severity. Although the Beck Depression Inventory has been widely used with adults, questions were raised regarding its appropriateness for use with adolescents. Abruzzini et al. Conducted a concurrent validity study to explore the utility of the BDI with adolescents. They also sought to determine if the test could successfully differentiate patients with depression from those without depression in a population of adolescents outpatients. Diagnosis generated from the concurrent administration of an instrument previously validated for use with adolescents were used as the criterion validators. The findings suggested that the BDI is valid for use for adolescents. Another type of criterion-related validity is predictive validity. If concurrent validity is used at the same time, then predictive validity from the word itself, predict, meaning future time. Test scores may be obtained at one time and the criterion measures obtained at a future time, usually after some intervening event has taken place. Measures of the relationship between college admissions tests and freshman grade point averages, for example, provide evidence of the test predictive validity of the admissions of tests. In settings where tests might be employed, such as a personal agency, a college admissions office, or warden's office, a high test predictive validity can be useful to aid to decision makers who must select successful students, productive workers, or good parole risk. Whether a test result is valuable in decision making depends on how well the test results improve selection decisions over decisions made without knowledge of test results. Example: if the measures of depression predicts future diagnosis of depression, then it would have high evidence of predictive validity. Now, when evaluating the predictive validity of a test, researchers must take into consideration the base rate of the occurrence of the variable in question, both as the variable exists in the general population and as it exists in the sample being studied. Base rate is the extent to which a particular trait, behavior, characteristic, or attribute exists in the population. We also have what we call hit rate. This may be defined as the proportion of people a test accurately identifies as possessing or exhibiting a particular trait, behavior, characteristic, or attribute. Hit rate example is: hit rate could refer to the proportion of people accurately predicted to be able to perform work at the graduate school level, or the proportion of neurological patients accurately identified as having brain tumor. Next, we also have what we called miss rate. May be defined as a proportion of people that test fails to identify as having or not having a particular characteristic or attribute. Next is the false positive and the false negative. So, when we say false positive, this is where the test predicted that the test taker did possess the particular characteristic or attribute being measured, when in fact the test taker did not. Again, the test predicted that the test taker did possess, but where in fact the test taker did not. Next, a false negative is a miss wherein the test predicted that the test taker did not possess the particular characteristic or attribute being measured, where in fact the test takers actually did. They are quite opposite. Judgments of criterion-related validity, whether concurrent or predictive, are based on two types of statistical evidence: the validity coefficient and the expectancy data. Validity coefficient is a correlation coefficient that provides a measure of the relationship between test scores and scores on the criterion measures. The correlation coefficient computed from a score on a psychodiagnostic test and the criterion score assigned by a psychodiagnostician is one example of a validity coefficient. And the last one under predictive validity is the incremental validity. This is the degree to which an additional predictor explains something about the criterion measures that is not explained by predictors already in use. Example for this is incremental validity may be used when predicting something like academic success in college. Grade point average, or GPA, at the end of the first year may be used as a measure of academic success. A study of potential predictors of GPA may reveal that time spent in the library and time spent studying are highly correlated with GPA. How much sleep a student's roommate allows the student to have during exam periods correlate with a GPA to a smaller context. What is the most accurate but most efficient way to predict GPA? One approach, employing the principles of incremental validity, is to start with the best predictor, the predictor that is most highly correlated with GPA. This may be time spent studying. Then, using multiple regression techniques, one would examine the usefulness of the other predictors. Even though time in the library is highly correlated with GPA, it may not possess incremental validity if it overlaps too much with the first predictor, the time spent studying. Said another way, if the time spent studying and the time in the library are so highly correlated with each other that they reflect essentially the same thing, then only one of them needs to be included as a predictor. Including both predictors will provide little new information. By contrast, the variable of how much sleep student's roommate allows the student to have during exams may have a good incremental validity. This is because it reflects a different aspect of preparing for exams, which is resting, from the first predictor, studying. You may also visit the link below to learn more.
The rest of the topic for Chapter 6 will be discussed by Ms. Jade Camare. This has been Ardie Louise Villapaz, Part 1 reporter. Thank you and mabuhay!